Yes, Slim. Look who's back with the fresh one, me. It's getting grimy now. It's getting mucky now. Yo!
Okay, so hello to everyone, and hello to everyone online also. And I'm very happy to welcome you to our, to our third session of this semester's Semiosalong, which is called Alter Semiotics. And today we will have two presenters as usual, and we will begin with our good friend Bogdana Paskaleva. We are so happy to have her here, and also to have all of you here online and here in the room. So yes, so some words for introducing Dr. Bogdana Paskaleva. She, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name more or less correctly.
Yes.
I'm back. Good. So Dr. Paskaleva, she teaches ancient and medieval literature and literature of Western Europe at the Faculty of Slavic Studies in Sofia University in Bulgaria. And her central scholar interests concern the problem of literary theory and history, especially the literature of classical antiquity and Italian Renaissance, as well as the problems of visual and literary image. And you might remember her from our summer school in Prague, where she was precisely talking about ekphrasis and very nice things. So she has also authored a monograph dedicated to Ovid's Metamorphoses. And this is very nice because we were, well, anyway, I just remember that in our first session, we had a reference to Galatea's myth, which of course is related to Ovid. So yes, very good to have these threads that connect each session. So, well, the title of her talk is To See the World Through Someone Else's Eyes, Ethnography and the Problem of the Other in Saussure. And we are really, really, really excited to hear this presentation. So please, Bogdana.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I will share my screen now. Hope it works. Can you see the slides? You see the slides?
Yes.
It's okay.
Yes, yes. Now we see.
Okay. Stop my video because it works better this way. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, and especially to Tyler, Ludmila, and Israel for organizing this wonderful series. What I am going to speak about today, it will be probably a little bit less theoretical and more historical compared to what we've heard in the last two sessions of the seminar. So I will start by making some remarks on the material. As you probably know, that the fact that Ferdinand de Saussure published almost nothing in his lifetime constitutes a huge issue in researching this author. So scholars are compelled to work with fragments and manuscripts that are very chaotic, indeterminate, full of inner contradictions, incoherences in every respect. And I will not go into details here about the history of Saussure's reception and research in linguistics and semiology. I would just like to point out once again that the manuscript and publication situation always leaves us with a high degree of uncertainty about whatever we claim about Saussure's ideas. So it's just this thing I wanted to say as a remark before starting the presentation. And now I will directly address the topic of selfhood and otherness. Okay, now unfortunately the slides don't work so well, but yeah. You see the second slide now?
Yes, we can
changed. Okay, okay. Sorry. So why did I propose to speak about ethnography? No matter how original Saussure's views on language were at his time, he was also very much inscribed in a 19th century tradition of linguistics, and especially the so-called Neogrammarian school. He graduated from the University of Leipzig in 1878 with a monograph on the topic of the ancient vowel system of the Indo-European languages, which remained his only published book. This type of historical and comparative studies was in fashion at that time. It was related to the recent or fairly recent discovery of the Sanskrit language as the earliest written language that was genealogically related to the European languages, with William Jones as the first one who pointed out the similarities of Sanskrit to ancient Greek and Latin. So this was at the end of the 18th century. Now, the discipline that was called ethnography at that time was related, of course, to the romantic discipline called Volkskunde, the research of traditional cultures, folklore, legends, etc. In this discipline, language was usually perceived as a national language, or at least as the language of an ethnic community, ethnic language, as a kind of a monument of the national or the ethnic spirit, the spirit of the community, as well as a document that could reveal earlier stages in the development of this national spirit. Saussure was, in a way, very critical towards this romantic narrative, and especially towards the romantic organicist thesis of the school of people like August Schleicher or Max Müller. The idea that language and national spirit were related in this direct way was not acceptable to Saussure. Because of his resistance to what was back then known as linguistic organicism, that entailed paradoxically the view that a language should be the object of natural sciences. But this doesn't mean that language was not related to the thought of a historical and cultural whole, a particular speaking community. And affirming that language has a social nature, Saussure reshaped the idea of the relation between language and culture, and thus between linguistics and ethnography, rather than just rejecting it. Okay, so it was through this historical and social idea of language, he somehow rearranged the relation between language and culture rather than just rejecting it. Okay, now there is a quotation from a really famous letter to Antoine Meillet. You've probably came across this letter at a certain point. It is a letter from January 1894, published by Émile Benveniste in 1916. And here Saussure famously complains to his colleague and friend that the inept theoretical and terminological framework that contemporary linguists are compelled to work with ruins for him all the joy and pleasure of researching language. And here is what he says. Okay, I will only read the English translation, but you can see the original. At the end, it is only the picturesque aspect of a language, that which distinguishes it from all other languages as pertaining to a certain people that has certain origins. It is this almost ethnographic aspect that is still retaining an interest for me. And more precisely, I don't have the pleasure anymore to give myself to this kind of study without second thoughts, and to enjoy a particularly stable element in a particular environment. So it is this almost ethnographic phrase that is interesting to me. Here, of course, it means something like characteristics, specifics of the element that gives a certain people its face, its personality. Now, the general theory, the linguistic theory, the general linguistics, is presented here as the mere instrument towards this goal, so studying the singular in language. As we now know, one of Saussure's terminological innovations regards the opposition of synchronic and diachronic point of view to language facts. In the structuralist reception of Saussure, synchrony was prioritized. This is the consequence of the published version of the course in general linguistics in 1916. There is this famous last sentence where synchronic approach to language is presented as like something like the only true scientific approach to language. But we know now that this final sentence is an editorial addition. So Saussure never stopped examining the historical or diachronic dimension of language. And since his primary area of study was Sanskrit, he continued to be interested in its particularity. From a very early point onwards, probably about 1981, 85, or somewhere thereabout, Saussure started a more systematic reasoning on the problems of general linguistics with a view to what he named semiology, the research of the signifying function of language. Later, he suggested that this signifying mechanism extended outside language into a more general field of human signifying activity, but at this early point, he was still only speaking about the semiological dimension of language. In one famous manuscript of this period, probably entitled On the Dual Essence of Language, but we are not sure if this is the title or what this means at all. So he develops the idea that language could exist as a scientific object only under particular circumstances. That is, language facts are not immediately given to the senses as the facts of natural sciences. They only appear, he claimed, to the eye of the linguist when the linguist takes up a certain position. And this Saussure calls the point of view. He lists 4 legitimate points of view, and 2 of them are synchronic and diachronic point of view. I am not going into details about the other 2 because they are kind of confused, but still they are versions of the diachronic, so aspects of the diachronic point of view. And later on, he was about to speak only about synchrony and diachrony, and the other two fell out. As one central problem that emerges here, he discerns the necessary and permanent intersection of these two aspects of language. So from now on, one of the cruxes for him is going to be the decision about how history is to be inscribed into a language system. So the important problem is how to understand the junction between synchronic and diachronic aspects. Now, I am making a jump ahead in history, and I come to the period after 1906. As you know, at this moment, Saussure was already holding his famous course in general linguistics at the University of Geneva. And now I will focus on some problems of Hindu thought that Saussure commented upon in his notes. So these are the so-called Harvard manuscripts. I will speak about a certain folder number 6, dedicated to the Indian culture and thought. So here we enter the realm of the otherness, so the foreign culture. In a folder called the blue folder contains pages that are dedicated to a review of a book by a certain Paul Outramar. You've probably never heard of him. I haven't either before reading this fragment. So the book was entitled A History of Theosophic Ideas in India, and its first volume was published in 1906. It was dedicated to Brahmanic theosophy. So the title is Brahmanic Theosophy of the first volume. The second volume was about to be published in 1923, 10 years after Saussure's death. So he never managed to read it, but still he was able to read this first volume about the theosophic ideas in India. So who is Paul Outramar? Just briefly, he was born in 1854 and died in 1930. He was, of course, a fellow Genevan and a professor, Orientalist at the same university. And he was one of Saussure's colleagues and friends. This is not surprising because it seems that everybody in Geneva was something like distant relatives or friends or colleagues, or at any rate, they knew each other very well. So in this first decade of the 20th century, he had some publications on the history of religions and on the culture of ancient India, Buddhist thought, and things like this. You can see some of the titles here, titles like the Buddhist Formula of the 12 causes, or To Live, an essay of theoretical and practical biosophy, the religion and life of the spirit, and so on. So he was interested in mysticism, including its more contemporary forms. Of course, his first area of study was historical mysticism, Oriental mysticism, and religious thoughts, but he was also interested in contemporary forms of mysticism. Of the 20th century, this was very much in fashion. Things like the so-called theosophy, different psychic phenomena, spiritism, etc. Okay, as we know now from the manuscripts, Saussure was also to a certain extent interested in more, let's say, eccentric subjects. For example, he participated in the research of the psychologist Theodore Flournoy on the phenomena of synesthesia, or later in the analysis of the discourse of a person named Catherine Elise Müller, a woman who claimed to have had psychic abilities. This second endeavor was again initiated by Flournoy and a couple of other friends, among whom Paul Outramar. At the end, so this Katrina Liesmüller claimed to have psychic abilities, and she had some sort of trances or psychic experience when she claimed that different spirits came to inhabit her body. And after being examined by Flornois, who was a serious psychologist at the time, he published a study on her case that became an instant bestseller. And you can see the title here, From India to the Planet Mars, a case of somnambulism with glossolalia. So the turn of the century was a period with high levels of public interest towards what was then called spiritism or parapsychology. So things that seem to us now like very non-scientific and counterintuitive, but still they didn't believe in spirits. They rather regarded this phenomena as something that could reveal aspects of human psychology. Okay, here is a brief excerpt of Saussure's notes on Outremar's first volume, Brahmanic Theosophy. And unfortunately, I didn't copy the original version of these texts. Of course, they are published by Maria Pia Marchese somewhere in the 90s, but I didn't copy the French text, so I am able only to present you the English translations. I'm sorry about that. It's just that I don't have access to the book right now. Okay, now I start with some remarks of Saussure on Outremar's book. So if you open the website of the Houghton Library, where these Harvard manuscripts are enlisted, you will see that the dating is very problematic because they are dated to the period of the 70s, 1871, 1881. But here he comments upon a book that was published 1906. So I'm not sure if the dating of the library is really precise because he couldn't have been able to read Outremar's book before 1906. But whatever, here we go with the quotation. The texts abundantly collected by Outremar do not leave any doubts that we can speak about schools, and even before speaking of schools, of course, he means schools of Hindu thought. There is interest in three psychological states. First, the state of being awake. Second, sleep with dreams, svapna. And third, sleep without dreams, nidra. And this third point, the nidra, constitutes a material distinction that is held to be primordial. End of quote. So a very confused passage follows. Saussure tries to explain the relation between these three states in Hindu culture, and it becomes clear that these states of the psyche are actually three hypostases of the ego, of the I, of which the nidra, the I that sleeps without dreaming, is the basic one. Next quotation. This is the practically a couple of pages further. We can characterize the fundamental conflict between India and our Occidental thought in the following manner. To the latter, there is a centuries-long question about the relation between the I, which includes all its proper sensations, and the not I. And for India, there is the perennial question about the relation between the not I and the I, excluding from this I the very same sensations, since they are not distinguished from the object. Not, so here is an interruption in the text. This is what explodes with a specific clarity in the doctrine of Sankhya, so perfectly pursued from one end to the other. When he says so perfectly pursued from one end to the other, he means the book of Ultramar, because this book is almost entirely dedicated to the doctrine of Sankhya as one of the schools of Hindu thought. Here one could see with the utmost clarity that the whole apparatus of the senses, antakarana, given as an actual optical box that does not concern the eye, the purusha, and here comes an illegible section. One of the conclusions that might be drawn from these particular premises without the aid of the texts is that consequently the state in which the eye finds itself in the psychological condition of dreamless sleep must represent the purity or integrity of the eye, given that it is only in this condition that nothing external can reach it. End of quote. So this conclusion, the final section that speaks about the conclusion, is actually not a conclusion made by Ultramar, but it belongs to Saussure himself. In his book, Ultramar doesn't speak about these three states of the soul. He only mentions the nidra very briefly in the section on yoga practices, but this analysis on the three states of the eye and the conclusion that the nidra is something like the 0 degree of selfhood is actually, it belongs to Saussure. Because I remind you that he was a specialist in Sanskrit. Unlike me, and I'm sorry if I don't pronounce the Hindu and Sanskrit words correctly. Okay, there comes a fragment with the title "À travers buissons," something like "through the thicket" or "across the thicket." And this is a French idiom, se sauver à travers le buisson. It equals something like to beat around the bush or to find a shortcut or something like this. And here is a very interesting section, to me, the most interesting part of this argument. Now, here he says the following: isn't it ridiculous, not to say intolerable, to remain always closed in one's own eye, completely subjugated to this little eye? I wouldn't care less to know the feelings of Octavian after the Battle of Actium, a nice topic for an essay in Latin, but I would give it all to be for 3 minutes this very Octavian, be it after or long before the battle, and even to be able for a second to be my own cook, to look at the world through her eyes without losing the ability to confront what I see with every single image that I will extract from that excursion. Of course, it is the same for all, but basically, this is the line that separates those minds or spirits, those minds who conceive of another mind or spirit only through themselves, and who constitute the eternal and quiet majority, from those who seek in vain yet ardently to get to know the world through something other than themselves. Okay, why am I quoting all these fragments? This type of personal observation, or even we might call it introspection, is comparatively rare in Saussure's notes. Of course, it could be found not so. It's not impossible to find such fragments, but it is comparatively rare. Now here we have this interesting relation between the historical research of a culture and the personal confession. Methodologically, the fact that there are 3 different words about the state of the eye in this foreign culture brings the linguist to the conclusion that in this culture, the eye is perceived differently compared to the European concept of the ego. This cultural anthropological observation leads him to meditation on his own attitude towards the problem of the eye. The distinction between the waking state, the sleep with dreams, and the dreamless sleep makes him appreciate this possibility. In a culture where the fundamental state of the I is this neutral 0 degree of selfhood, the nidra, the dreamless sleep, one can start fantasizing on the self of the other. Here, Saussure admits having always been one of those who strive to achieve cognition of the world not only through themselves, but through someone else's eyes as well. He seems to be, first of all, attracted to the idea of comparing his own perceptions to those of somebody else, of another. So basically, being something like a multiple person, seeing the world through someone else's eyes and at the same time retaining the memory of his own. Now, you probably already guessed what I am suggesting here. Of course, since this reincarnation is impossible, a similar result could be achieved through research into languages of other cultures. So it is linguistics and semiotics that could function in a similar manner instead of this reincarnation. This would suggest that for Saussure, language in the broad sense, as both verbal and cultural dimensions, could be envisioned as a representation of an alternative worldview, an alternative point of view. This last point could be interpreted in a twofold manner. One can assume that language is something like a repository where the parameters of the alternative culture or alternative worldview are, let's say, mirrored or represented or contained. The second possibility would be to assume that language shapes the world of the other as a social entity, as a community, a worldview framework that could modify and form the perceptions of the individual. And things like this we can read in, for example, in the research of Eduard Sapir or even in Yelmslev. And I would say that Saussure's idea probably includes both. And this is the result of his concept of language as both a historical and consequently a social phenomenon and a semiological phenomenon. The individual is already inscribed in this grid, meaning that the hermeneutics could go both ways. Based on concrete texts or individual speech acts, we can infer about a whole culture's worldview, including cultures that are very distanced both geographically and temporally. But also departing from the social, we can infer about somebody else's way of seeing the world. This interest in language as a document about previous states of a certain culture leads us back to one of the linguists that were most admired by Saussure. His name was Adolphe Pictet. His profile was that of an Indo-Europeanist, and his most important publication was the Indo-European Origins or the Ancient Aryas. And here on the slide, you can see some information about him. He was in contact with persons who were engaged in the Romanticism movement. So he was personally acquainted to August Schlegel, and he was shaped in this Romantic tradition. And you can see some of the titles of his important publications. As I said, the last one was the most important for Saussure, the Indo-European Origins. In his early years, Saussure was something like a pupil of Pictet's. This is about 1873, 74, because Pictet died in 1875, so it was the last years of his life. And Saussure always spoke of his teacher with great reverence. His earliest experience with reading the Indo-European origins was of great excitement, and the book inspired him to write his first study, of course in quotation marks, his first study in general linguistics at the age of 15. In this paper, he tried to reduce all Indo-European languages to 12 basic roots, and he somehow it's something that we are going to find later as a project in Nikolai Mar's linguistic paleontology. But of course, here, when Saussure was 15 years old and still he was practically a schoolboy, even at this early point, we could find the fantasy of a universal language. And of course, it was developed in a still very naive way, but later this fantasy will be important and it will be somehow realized through the Esperanto language. Okay, in an autobiographical note of 1903, published in 1960 by Robert Godel, Saussure speaks about the period that he spent with Pictet, but less known is that in the manuscript, another manuscript, so this manuscript is not so popular. It's number 369, whatever. It was one of the manuscripts that were acquired by the Library of Geneva in 1996. So in this manuscript, we see a notebook that contains the drafts of the fragment later to be included in the autobiographical note about the years 1873, 1877, or 76, 77. And in this material, we can see how irresolute Saussure was about the final version of the representation of these events of his relation to Adolphe Pictet. He was trying to retell the same episodes of their first meeting, of their conversations, and so on. So he was trying to retell the same episodes of his life 3 or 4 times with small differences. This hesitation can be read as a sign of his own uncertainty of how to assess the spiritual legacy of his teacher. However vehement his critique was against the organicist view of language, we don't see anything as critical towards Pictet. And in Pictet's research on the Indo-European origins, we find this ethnographic description of the presumed people of the ancient Aryas. Of course, this was very much a project of Pictet's own fantasy. And something in Pictet's highly dubious research remained in Saussure on the level of fantasy. In fact, some passages of the Harvard manuscripts very much resemble the type of reasoning that we find in Pictet's books. And here comes a long quotation from the methodological introduction to the Indo-European origins. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to squeeze the translation and the original in on one slide, so I will read the English version, and if you wish, we can go back to the French original later. Okay, we often observe, now this is Pictet, the methodological introduction to his research on the ethnography of this presumed reconstructed people of the ancient Aryas. We often observe that the language of a people presents the truest image of all its ways of being, and that it contains, like in a receptacle, the most certain documents about this people's physical and moral history. Nevertheless, this is only true about primitive languages, where words are immediate images of things themselves, which they express through a characteristic meaning and not just an arbitrary sound. A signifying word directly reveals the idea that has produced it, And a speech composed of similar terms allows us to observe, like through a transparent veil, the work of the mind or the spirit that has presided over its formation. Consequently, if by way of the possibly most complete comparison of those terms that all Aryan languages had in common, we can bring them back to their initial form and rediscover their real signification, we would have formed an idea, at least approximatively, about the material, social, and moral state of the people who created this primitive speech. End of quote. So researchers like John Joseph and Boris Gasparov pointed out that Saussure both went beyond the methodology of his mentor and somehow managed to remain true to some aspects of his thought. And indeed, we see here a great deal of romantic keywords like the spirit of the people that gives birth to a speech, this direct relation between words and things themselves, and so on. So these kind of romantic romantic notions is something that Saussure would have rejected, and he did. But still, it is the history of the people that could lead us back to similar points. And we see that the passage is also revealing about Pictet's view on the opposition arbitrary natural in language signification. This element should probably be read in the light of Pictet's earlier books. This is something I'm not going to speak about now. So even in his more mature years, when he was working on ancient versification and the Germanic legends, Saussure never ceased inferring ethnographic elements from linguistic data, although his methodology reached far beyond Pictet's somewhat naive deductive etymological method. What remained for Saussure was the fantasy to see the world through someone else's eyes, a fantasy that gained flesh in Katrine Liesmüller psychic visions, for example, when she was claiming to be somebody else, someone from a different epoch. First, she started to claim that she was possessed by the spirits of like more normal spirits, like Queen Marie Antoinette or Victor Hugo. But then at a certain point, she decided that she's possessed by the spirit of an Indian princess from the 15th century, who was, of course, speaking Sanskrit. So this is the point where Saussure entered the sessions. He was invited to research the presumed Sanskrit, spoken Sanskrit by this Katrine Liesmüller. And later, she also came into contact with the prince of the planet Mars. And even at certain points, she even claimed that different parts of her body were actually possessed by different spirits. So Marie Antoinette was in one part of the body and the Indian princess in another one. So it's something like this split personality or multiple personality that I was talking about earlier. So although he never believed in spirits, Saussure still analyzed the discourse of the psychic quite seriously, because probably the idea was that there are serious observations to be made about the nature of language as a psychological fact. Okay, and now I come to the last part of my talk. And I come back to his early years. In 1874, when he was a schoolboy, Saussure won the praises of his teachers and schoolmates in writing poetry on classical subjects. He even got the first prize in a poetry competition at his school in 1875. One of his poems, The Child of Virgil, written in September 1974, is accompanied by a very interesting note in the margin. And here I inserted a part of the manuscript so that we can see his handwriting. This is a very early manuscript, and you can see it's still very easily read. it's the handwriting is still very beautiful and clean. And you can see the date, September 74. So at the central part, this is the poem, and on the left, you can see the marginal note, which was included a year later. So it's dated 1975. And now I am going to read this marginal note that is very telling, I think. So this is the transcription. Transcription is mine because, again, I didn't have access to the published version. It is published, but I had to transcribe it myself. And the translation is by John Joseph. So I'm reading the English translation. In writing these verses, I was a pagan, much more pagan than Virgil. I spent several days believing myself transported to the time when aureus hanc vitam in terris turnus agebat. And this is a quotation from Virgil. Of course, this was the life that golden Saturn led in our land. In order to write the poem, I ran through fields like a madman. I sat beneath the oaks above Jantot, and I combined into a delicious impression the feeling of nature and the perfume of antiquity. The false old beech tree, the yews pasture, the spring in the forest, all this is up there on the hill. And when I go back to visit them, or when I reread this piece, I believe that I am evoking memories from 3,000 years ago and not an episode from last year. So much does it seem to me that I lived all this. So to me, this important part is that the memories are from 3,000 years ago, as if he lived this experience, this pagan experience. Here again, we see the fantasy of being somebody else, in this case, Virgil, or somebody who is pagan as Virgil was. And to have actually lived Virgil's pagan experience. Indeed, if we open a collection of the scientific publication of Ferdinand de Saussure, this is a volume edited by Charles Bailly in 1922, containing all texts that Saussure published during his lifetime. We can see that all the articles that he published in his lifetime are actually dedicated to such problems that he termed as the almost ethnographic aspect of language in the letter of Meillet. Most of them are brief texts, half a page or something, on very narrow and particular matters, such as the meaning of the name Agamemnon, the relationship between the Sanskrit word Liguba and the Slavic word Lobuzati, or different forms of the number 6 in different Indo-European languages. Some of the articles are longer and interconnected, as those dedicated to the Lithuanian language, Lithuanian accentuation and cases, but they are still very specific and very much try to relate the language to the ethnographic presentation of the people. There is not one argument concerning more general linguistic or semiological questions. It seems that Saussure estimated as ready to be published only diachronic studies in Indo-European languages. Surprisingly, on the backdrop of the image he has in the traditional structural linguistics, because now we have this image of Saussure as somebody who dealt with general linguistics, while he only published texts on historical linguistics. It is then probably more justified to read his thoughts on synchronic linguistics as rooted in historical study of language, rather than based on an abstract idea of universal semiological activity. And if I may come back to the problem of the intersection between synchrony and diachrony, I would say that in Saussure's view, only the right understanding of synchrony could bring us to the right understanding of diachrony, and vice versa. So we should always somehow keep in mind these two dimensions. And this would be all from my talk. Thank you. Should I stop sharing the slides now, or?
Indeed, thank you so much. And yes, we have time for questions. Do we have questions here or from the audience online? I think Lele wants to speak. Please.
Just a little bit of info to add what I already said to you. There is a wonderful genetical philological edition of the manuscript à travers Buisson. I saw this in 2016. Is a little envelope. It's like this. With a sheet with a lot of raturs. I was saying there is a good philological edition, but by Giuseppe Dottavi on the Genesis journal of this text, and namely à travers Buisson. I think it can be interesting for you if you don't already know.
Thank you very much. This is
also I wrote on this, but not as a primary object, but I wrote on this in a volume which is called Emotion Metacognition by Palgrave. But there are also other who call this manuscript. There are Pierre-Yves Testenoir.
Yes.
A good text on this. Only this. It was only a bit of information to complete what you said.
Thank you. This is really important. I would love to read this secondary texts, of course, and I will find them. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to see the manuscript because, as you know, the manuscripts in Geneva are all digitized, and you can reach them online. They are accessible, but nothing of the Harvard manuscripts is accessible. So I only was able to see the list of the manuscripts on the website of the Harvard Library. But it's great. I know that there is a critical edition of this text, but unfortunately, where I am now, it was inaccessible to me. Thank you again. I will definitely search for these publications.
Indeed. Thank you so much. And we also have a question from Tartu.
Hi, can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
Okay, great presentation. I really enjoyed. I actually have one question and a comment. So when you said about the language having these, let's say, scientific aspects, can you relate that to language typology, perhaps?
Could you say something more specific about what kind of language typology you have in mind?
Like, like how the language is structured, like the main basis of the language, syntax,
Yeah.
like stuff, the ordination, like the word relation, all of that stuff, because as I understand, closely connected to the science of the language. I'm actually taking this course this semester, and really like we're digging into deep into all the languages, older languages, non-Indo-European languages. So I'm just asking, like, since you're a since you deal with language and Saussure, like, what is your point of view in that?
Okay, now I think I understand. Is this Anna? Am I right?
Anna.
That this okay? Okay. Now, thank you very much.
Only one who can my name perfectly.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, I think you're right. It is a very important problem, and I don't think that I have a short answer. Of course, it should be something like this. So, a language structure should be somehow should matter somehow. As when it comes to ethnographic or I don't know, or cultural dimensions of a certain people. For example, I might say that for example Balkan languages, I think at least Balkan languages um, uh, are able to disclose aspects of what developed as a Balkan culture. As you probably know, there is this notion of languages that that form something called language community. I think I'm not sure
Yeah.
about the English version of the term, but these are languages that are not genetically connected, but still they develop similar traits only because the cultures of the different peoples who speak these languages are actually very close to each other, and there are some influences between them, and they develop similar language structure. For example, Balkan languages developed analytic structure of the language. We don't have cases. We have so we
Cases.
excuse me.
Croatian language, my native language, has
Yeah,
cases.
Croatian language, but it is not part. Croatian and Serbian are not parts of this Balkan language community. So it only includes Romanian, Bulgarian, Turkish, Greek, and Albanian, I think. So it is a theory by Christian Zanfeld from the 20s or the 30s, and these languages that were part of the Ottoman Empire. So these ethnic groups were part of the Ottoman Empire for a long period of time, and they developed similar traits of the languages. For example.
Okay, thanks. And my second question, and after that, a brief comment. I promise I will be over. So my second question, I heard you're into Ovid's Metamorphoses. Like
Yes.
6 years ago, I will also like wrote this paper about. I actually did a semiotic analysis of his first and 11th so like chapter of his Metamorphoses. Anyways, I wanted to ask you, how would you like, let's say, put this like present Saussure's model into metamorphoses? Like, how would that be? Like, I can already imagine otherness in metamorphoses, because you know everybody like in metamorphoses pretends like it's related to mythology, and you know how gods are, like they play with mortals and they change shapes. So how would you like apply the Saussure into metamorphoses?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. In fact, when I worked on Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it was connected to Saussure, and as it was said, my primary areas of interest are classical literature, and you may guess that my first interest in Saussure didn't concern general linguistics, but rather his theory of the anagrams. You probably know about that. So he had this theory that there is an alternative principle of versification in ancient poetry, and he named it anagram, and then he introduced hundreds of other notions. But I never thought of applying this idea of the selfhood and the otherness to the metamorphosis. And of course, you are right that maybe we should think about this change of form, and this possibility to imagine ourselves living through somebody else's experience, because this was this was what was the most interesting element of this note on the Hindu thought. How can we experience somebody else's experience, which is of course
Actually,
impossible.
now that you mentioned that, and this is actually where my comment goes. So you
Okay.
mentioned this sleep without dreaming, and you kind of connected this without with someone else getting into someone's skin, getting into like seeing throughout someone else's experience. Okay. That's a great comparison, but when I think about that, when you want to see, let's say, throughout someone else, you imagine that person, you know, your fantasy and imagination start working. And because of that, when fantasy and imagination start working, dream also has to come in that place, because like whatever you think, whatever you live through, it has to represent again in the dream. I don't know, like, how is this sleeping without dreams possible? Because if I were to go to sleep and not to dream, I would rather die, to be honest. I don't want to sleep if I don't dream.
I completely agree with you. I think you're right that when we want to imagine somebody else's experience, we should imagine something. So we should start having some fantasies, images, and so on. What I think was important to Saussure, and what he found interesting in this Hindu thought, is that all the images that we can represent in our fantasy or in our memory, these images are thought to be in Hindu thought, in Oriental thought. They are somehow understood as not part of me. So they are something that could be detached from me, and that could be replaced by something else, compared with this replaced thing. So this idea of the 0 degree of this sleeping without dreams, it is this element that makes it possible to have all these different fantasies and all these different images coming from different sides. I think that was the most striking for Saussure. So if you want to have images and to compare them, you need some basis where you can implant or apply different directions of image construction.
Thank you very much. This I really enjoyed in your talk, and I really hope that you will that you already registered or will register to the World Congress of Semiotics, because I would love to meet you and talk with you more. Honestly,
Thank you, Anna. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you. Thanks a lot to both of you. And yeah, I think this Sprachbunde, they translate it as language union sometimes.
Yes, of course. Yes. Language union. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I just wasn't able to remember. Yeah.
And we have time for a very short question, if there is any. If not, I have one.
Okay.
About this, I was wondering about this study that Saussure wrote when he was 15 or something, whether that was available in the archives in Geneva, because I know whether you could tell us about that, and also just tell us a little bit, because I know that was also very important for his relationship with Ted, and there was like some opinions he had about it.
Yeah.
So if you could just tell us briefly about that.
Okay, so it was really this very episode that he was trying to retell a number of times in his manuscripts, and in the end he inserted one of the versions of this story in his autobiographical note of 1903. It was really, it seems that, to me at least, it seems like a traumatic experience. So he wrote this paper. Unfortunately, it is a part of the Harvard manuscript, so you cannot read it as a facsimile, as a digitized manuscript on the internet, only in Harvard. But there is a publication of the text, and I think it is published in some of the volumes of Cahiers Ferdinand de Saussure. And as far as I remember, it was published by Roman Jakobson. So it is easily available as text, not as a manuscript. And indeed, it was some sort of a trauma for Saussure. I think that this is, of course, a kind of a speculation of mine, that he was so stressed about Pictet's reaction to what he wrote on general linguistics that he never published anything on general linguistics anymore, because the reaction of Pictet, the way Saussure tells it, was something like, well, young man, you have right away taken the bull by the horns. So you are so young, you know nothing, but you are trying to approach the biggest problems in linguistics. And of course, he kindly told him that it's really not very well supported or even very well wrote out idea. And yet there is this very interesting moment that actually Francis Candon speaks about it in one of his books, that in fact this idea was reproduced later by Nicolai Marr. So it wasn't completely thrown away from the history of linguistics. And yeah, this is my probably somewhat fantastic theory that the trauma of this first paper remained for the rest of Saussure's life, and he never wanted to publish anything on general linguistics anymore. Yeah, you can easily find it in the Cahiers Ferdinand de Saussure. In some of the volumes, I don't remember what's the number, but it was published.
Okay, good. Thank you. Because yeah, I remember reading Joseph's retelling of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was really amazed also by the content of the manuscript. It's really, really cool.
It's really cool. You're right. It's really cool. Even if so I don't know, so crazy. It's really cool.
Yes, yes, very interesting. But thank you very much again, Bogdana. And
thank you all. And for the suggestions, the reading suggestions, thank you. I will really check them out.
Good. Yes, and I will get in touch with you soon also about other things.
Okay. Thank you.
But, so yes.
Yes, there is the link there is a link on the chat. Yeah, on but not only me, also Violencia Rivas
Yeah, but Violencia Rivas.
Okay, thank you. That's great.
Okay, thank you. And now we are ready to welcome our second presenter, Professor Vinicius Romanini. Professor Romanini, he's a